I was working my shift at the county clerk's office when I first encountered the documents that would eventually expose one of the most brazen real estate fraud schemes our county had seen in decades. It was a Tuesday morning in early spring, the kind of day when winter hadn't quite released its grip. But you could sense change coming in the quality of light filtering through the office windows. My job involved processing property transfers and title changes, mundane bureaucratic work that most people found tedious, but that I'd always approached with care, because I understood these documents represented people's homes, their financial security, their life's work. The paperwork that crossed my desk that morning appeared routine at first glance, a property transfer for a single-family home in one of the older residential neighborhoods, the kind of modest post-war construction that housed working-class families for generations. But something about the documents felt wrong in ways I couldn't immediately articulate. Small inconsistencies that triggered the instinct you develop after 15 years of processing legal paperwork. The signature on the deed transfer looked shaky, inconsistent with the bold signatures on earlier documents in the property's history. The notary stamp was from a company I'd never encountered, despite knowing most of the legitimate notary services in the county. The transfer price seemed suspiciously low for the current market, suggesting either extreme financial distress or something more sinister. I pulled the property's complete file and started cross-referencing the new transfer documents against historical records. The house had been owned by the same family for 38 years, purchased in 1985 by Robert and Claire Marino, a couple who'd raised 3 children there and paid off their mortgage steadily over decades. Robert had died 2 years ago, according to the death certificate in the file, leaving the property solely to his widow, Claire. Now, 71 years old and living alone in the house, she'd shared with her husband for nearly 4 decades. The recent transfer documents claimed to show Claire selling the property for roughly half its assessed value to an LLC I'd never heard of, a transaction that made no sense unless Claire was facing extreme financial pressure or cognitive decline that made her vulnerable to exploitation. But what really caught my attention was a handwritten note in the margin of one document, so faint it had almost escaped notice, showing what appeared to be a different signature than the one on the official transfer paperwork. Someone had practiced forging Claire Marino's signature, and they'd been careless enough to leave evidence of their practice attempts in the documents they'd submitted for official processing. This wasn't a legitimate sale. This was fraud, possibly elder abuse, a scheme to steal a widow's home through forged documents and bureaucratic manipulation. I immediately flagged the documents and brought them to my supervisor, explaining the inconsistencies I'd identified and my suspicion that we were looking at attempted property theft. My supervisor, a woman named Patricia who'd worked in the clerk's office for 25 years, examined the documents carefully, her expression growing increasingly concerned as she noted the same red flags I'd identified. She made the decision to hold the transfer pending investigation, to contact Claire Marino directly to verify she'd actually authorized the sale, and to notify law enforcement about potential fraud. This kind of scam had been increasing in our county over the past few years. Patricia explained criminals targeting elderly homeowners, particularly widows and widowers, living alone, forging signatures on property transfers, and stealing homes worth hundreds of thousands of dollars through paperwork manipulation. The victims often didn't discover the theft until they received eviction notices from the criminals, who now technically held legal title to their homes, by which point recovering the property required expensive litigation that many elderly victims couldn't afford. We'd caught this attempt early, Patricia said, before the transfer was completed and recorded, which meant we might actually be able to prevent the theft and catch the people responsible. She asked me to document everything I'd observed, to preserve all the paperwork, including that incriminating signature practice in the margins, and to prepare a detailed report for the district attorney's office. While Patricia made phone calls to law enforcement and to Claire Marino, I continued examining the LLC that was attempting to acquire the property. The company was newly registered, only 3 months old, with a business address that turned out to be a mail drop at a commercial shipping center. The registered agent was someone named James Reeves, a name that meant nothing to me, but that further research revealed was associated with multiple similar LLCs, all registered within the past year, all involved in suspicious property transactions, flagged by various county offices across the state. This wasn't an isolated incident or an opportunistic crime by amateurs. This was an organized operation, a sophisticated fraud scheme targeting vulnerable elderly homeowners, systematically stealing properties through forged documents and shell companies designed to obscure the real perpetrators. James Reeves was probably a frontman, someone paid to lend his name to paperwork, while others orchestrated the actual fraud and profited from stolen properties. The scale of it was staggering. Patricia and I identified at least 7 other properties in our county alone, where similar transfers had been attempted or completed, all involving elderly homeowners, all using the same network of shell companies and suspicious notaries, all following the same pattern of undervalued sales and questionable documentation. We were looking at a criminal enterprise that had probably stolen millions of dollars in property across multiple counties, exploiting legal loopholes and bureaucratic inefficiencies to conduct theft in plain sight through official channels. The phone call to Claire Marino produced exactly the response we'd anticipated and dreaded. Patricia put the call on speaker so I could hear, and Claire's voice came through confused and frightened, saying she'd never agreed to sell her home, had never met anyone named James Reeves, had never signed any documents authorizing a property transfer. She'd been contacted several weeks ago by men claiming to represent the county assessor's office, she explained, who'd told her there were problems with her property taxes and title that needed to be resolved immediately. They'd seemed official, had badges and paperwork, had used terminology Claire didn't understand, but that sounded legitimate. They'd asked her to sign various documents, which they'd told her were routine administrative updates required because of Robert's death, and the property title changed to her name alone. Claire had been grieving, overwhelmed by the complexity of managing property and finances alone after Robert's death, trusting that these official-seeming men were helping her rather than robbing her. She'd signed papers without reading them carefully, hadn't kept copies, hadn't thought to verify anything because she'd assumed government representatives could be trusted. It was a heartbreaking story, of vulnerability exploited, trust weaponized against someone whose generation had been raised to respect authority and assume official-looking people with badges were legitimate. Patricia assured Claire that we'd stop the transfer, that her home was safe, that law enforcement would investigate who'd targeted her. But I could hear the tremor in Claire's voice, the fear that had been planted by this attempted theft, the realization that she'd come very close to losing everything because she'd been too trusting and too isolated to recognize a scam designed to prey on exactly her circumstances. After the call, Patricia and I sat in her office, trying to process the implications of what we'd uncovered. This fraud scheme was operating with disturbing sophistication. The criminals had fake badges, official-looking documents, enough knowledge of property law and county procedures to make their scam credible to victims who weren't experts. They were specifically targeting elderly widows and widowers, people who were grieving and overwhelmed, people whose generation tended to trust authority figures, and who often lacked the support systems or technical knowledge to verify what they were being told. The scheme was particularly insidious because it exploited both grief and ignorance, using the confusion and vulnerability that followed a spouse's death as an opportunity for theft. Patricia said she'd seen variations of this scam before, but never at this scale, or with this level of organization. Usually it was individual opportunists, targeting 1 or 2 victims, not coordinated operations, stealing dozens of properties through systematic fraud. The sophistication suggested either very smart criminals or people with insider knowledge of how county property systems worked, how to create documents that would pass initial review, how to time submissions to avoid scrutiny. We agreed that stopping Claire's property theft was just the beginning, that we needed to identify all the victims in our county and coordinate with other jurisdictions to understand the full scope of the criminal operation. The district attorney's office sent investigators the next day, and I spent several hours walking them through everything I'd discovered, showing them the forged signatures, the shell companies, the pattern of suspicious transfers. They were particularly interested in the handwritten signature practice I'd found, calling it a gift that proved criminal intent and would be crucial for prosecution if we could identify who'd created those documents. The investigators asked about other potential victims, about patterns I'd noticed, about any names or companies that appeared repeatedly across the suspicious transactions. I provided copies of everything I'd flagged, explained my concerns about the scale of the operation, suggested that whoever was running this scheme had to have some knowledge of county procedures and timing to avoid detection as long as they had. One investigator, a detective named Martinez who specialized in financial crimes, told me I'd probably saved Claire Marino's home and possibly prevented future thefts by catching this attempt early. He explained that most of these scams weren't discovered until victims received eviction notices, by which point the criminals had sold the properties to unwitting third-party buyers, making recovery legally complicated and expensive. By stopping the transfer before it was completed and recorded, we'd preserved evidence and maintained Claire's clear title, giving prosecutors a clean case to pursue against whoever had targeted her. What happened next surprised everyone involved in the investigation, revealing connections and complications none of us had anticipated. 2 days after the investigators interviewed Claire Marino to get her detailed account of how she'd been targeted, a man walked into the district attorney's office and demanded to speak with whoever was handling the investigation into the attempted theft of his sister-in-law's home. The man was Vincent Caruso, and his name meant nothing to me or to most of the county officials handling Claire's case. But Detective Martinez recognized him immediately, his face going pale as he realized who was sitting in the waiting area asking about a property fraud investigation. Vincent Caruso was the younger brother of Robert Marino, Claire's deceased husband. Robert had changed his last name when he'd married Claire, had deliberately distanced himself from his birth family, had built a life that had nothing to do with the world he'd grown up in. That world was organized crime, and Vincent Caruso was one of the most powerful crime bosses in the state, running operations that federal prosecutors had been trying to dismantle for decades. Robert had left that life behind completely at age 25, had gone legitimate with his brother's blessing, had raised his family in peaceful anonymity, while Vincent built a criminal empire. But despite their different paths, the brothers had maintained contact, had visited occasionally, had stayed connected even though their lives occupied completely different moral universes. Vincent's appearance at the district attorney's office created immediate complications that no one quite knew how to handle. On one hand, he was a known criminal with suspected involvement in murders, extortion, drug trafficking, and money laundering, someone law enforcement wanted to prosecute rather than cooperate with. On the other hand, he was a family member of a crime victim, and his interest in his sister-in-law's case was technically legitimate, regardless of his background. Detective Martinez made the decision to speak with Vincent, recording the conversation and making clear this was an official interview, not a negotiation or collaboration. What emerged from that conversation was both helpful to the investigation and deeply troubling from a legal and ethical standpoint. Vincent explained that he'd only recently learned about the attempted theft of Claire's home, that Claire herself hadn't told him, because she barely knew him. Robert had kept his family life separate from his brother's world, hadn't introduced Claire to Vincent until after they'd been married for years, had maintained only minimal contact to protect his family from any association with organized crime. But Robert's children knew their uncle better, had maintained closer relationships, and one of them had mentioned to Vincent that their mother was being harassed by people claiming to represent the county, that she'd signed papers she didn't understand. Vincent had immediately recognized this as a scam and had started making inquiries, learning through his own networks that a fraud ring was operating in the county, stealing properties from elderly homeowners through forged documents. Vincent provided Detective Martinez with information about the fraud ring that law enforcement hadn't been able to obtain through conventional investigation, names of the actual organizers, beyond the front man, James Reeves, details about how the operation was structured, locations where forged documents were being prepared, even information about other victims across multiple counties. The question was whether this information could be used legally, whether evidence obtained from a criminal source would be admissible in court, whether cooperating with Vincent Caruso meant the district attorney's office was making a deal with the devil. Martinez brought these concerns to his superiors, and debates raged about how to handle Vincent's involvement. He was offering to help catch criminals who'd targeted his sister-in-law, which was ostensibly pro-social, but his methods of gathering intelligence about the fraud ring almost certainly involved illegal activities and threats of violence that law enforcement couldn't officially condone or rely upon. There was also the question of what Vincent wanted in return. Was he offering information out of familial loyalty, or did he expect favorable treatment for himself or his organization in exchange for helping solve this case? Vincent claimed he wanted nothing except to see the people who'd targeted Claire prosecuted, that this was personal rather than transactional, that his brother Robert would have expected him to protect Claire after his death, even though Robert had spent his entire adult life avoiding any connection to Vincent's criminal activities. Whether this was genuine or calculated, whether Vincent was motivated by love or strategy or both, was impossible to determine with certainty. The district attorney ultimately decided to accept Vincent's information, but to independently verify everything before using it as the basis for prosecution. They couldn't be seen as partnering with organized crime, couldn't give Vincent official status as an informant, but they could investigate the leads he'd provided and build cases using legal methods once they knew where to look. This approach satisfied no one. Prosecutors wanted more cooperation with Vincent, who clearly had extensive knowledge about the fraud ring, while civil liberties advocates argued that any use of information from Vincent Caruso tainted the investigation and violated the rights of defendants who'd be prosecuted based on intelligence gathered through intimidation and Duagrate's Blaine criminal methods. I watched these debates from my peripheral position as the clerk who'd initially flagged the suspicious documents, fascinated and troubled by how complicated the situation had become. A straightforward property fraud case had evolved into something involving organized crime, prosecutorial ethics, family loyalty, and questions about whether protecting vulnerable victims justified accepting help from criminals who had their own agendas and methods. Meanwhile, Claire Marino was largely unaware of these complications, knowing only that her home was safe and that law enforcement was pursuing the people who'd tried to steal it. She'd been visited by Vincent once, after he'd learned about the scam, had accepted his assurance that she'd be protected, had probably not fully understood who her brother-in-law was, or what his protection might entail. Using Vincent's information as a starting point, law enforcement launched coordinated raids across 3 counties, arresting 12 people involved in the property fraud ring. James Reeves was arrested at his home, where investigators found documents relating to dozens of property scams, forged signatures, fake notary stamps, and detailed records of the criminal operation. The evidence was overwhelming. This wasn't a case that would be hard to prosecute, given the documentation the criminals had carelessly preserved. Other arrests included the men who'd posed as county officials to trick Claire into signing documents, the actual organizers who'd planned the operation, and several attorneys who'd prepared fraudulent legal documents knowing they were being used to steal properties. The scale of the fraud was even larger than initially suspected. Investigators identified over 40 properties across 5 counties that had been stolen or targeted, representing more than $15 million in assets taken from elderly homeowners who'd been systematically victimized. Some victims had already lost their homes and were living with relatives or in assisted care facilities, displaced by theft they'd never understood or been able to fight. The arrests made regional news. Reporters covering the story of a sophisticated fraud ring that had operated for nearly 2 years before being exposed, victimizing some of the most vulnerable members of the community, while hiding behind fake credentials and legitimate-seeming paperwork. What the news coverage didn't include was Vincent Caruso's role in breaking open the investigation. That information was carefully omitted from official statements, prosecutors recognizing that admitting they'd received help from a mob boss would complicate prosecutions and raise ethical questions they'd prefer to avoid. Vincent himself maintained complete silence about his involvement, never claiming credit, never seeking publicity, apparently content to have helped Claire without needing recognition. I only knew the full story because Martinez had briefed county officials involved in the investigation, explaining the complicated provenance of key intelligence, so we'd understand why certain evidence had to be carefully documented to show it came from legal investigation rather than Vincent's extra-legal inquiries. The prosecutor's official narrative was that my identification of the forged signatures had triggered a broader investigation that uncovered the fraud ring, which was technically true, even if it omitted significant context about how investigators had known where to look and whom to target. This sanitized version of events allowed prosecution to proceed without complications, but it also obscured the troubling reality that justice for Claire and other victims had depended partly on the intervention of organized crime, that the legal system had been outmaneuvered by sophisticated criminals, until a more sophisticated criminal had provided the intelligence needed to dismantle the scheme. The trial of the fraud ring's organizers took place 10 months after the initial arrests, and I was called to testify about the documents I'd flagged and the inconsistencies I'd identified. Sitting in the witness box describing the forged signatures and suspicious notary stamps felt surreal, knowing that my routine diligence had been the thread that unraveled an elaborate criminal operation. The defense attorneys tried to attack my analysis, suggesting I wasn't a handwriting expert and couldn't definitively prove the signatures were forged. But prosecutors countered with actual experts who'd performed detailed forensic analysis, confirming what my instincts had initially suggested. The defendants looked ordinary in their courtroom attire, nothing obviously criminal or threatening about their appearances, just people who'd chosen to steal from vulnerable elderly victims for profit. James Reeves testified against the other organizers in exchange for a reduced sentence, explaining how the operation worked, how they'd identified targets through obituaries and property records, how they'd created fake credentials and practiced signatures, how they'd prepared documents they thought would pass county review. His testimony was damning, showing premeditation and deliberate targeting of victims chosen for their vulnerability, demonstrating that every aspect of the scheme was calculated to exploit grief and confusion for financial gain. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all major counts against all defendants. Claire Marino attended the sentencing hearing, sitting in the courtroom gallery while the judge delivered lengthy prison terms to the people who'd tried to steal her home. I sat several rows behind her, watching as the judge spoke about the particular cruelty of crimes that targeted elderly victims, that exploited trust and grief, that weaponized official-seeming authority to rob people of homes they'd worked their entire lives to own. The sentences were substantial. The primary organizers received 15 to 20 years in federal prison. The men who'd posed as county officials received 8 to 12 years. Even James Reeves received 5 years despite his cooperation. The judge made clear these sentences were meant to send a message about how seriously The justice system took elder fraud, about the consequences of systematically victimizing vulnerable populations. After the sentencing, Claire stopped briefly in the courthouse hallway to thank me for catching the fraud, her eyes wet with emotion as she said, I'd saved her home and possibly her life, that she'd have been homeless and devastated if the theft had succeeded. I told her I'd just been doing my job, but she shook her head and insisted I'd done more than that I'd cared enough to look carefully at documents others might have processed routinely without noticing the warning signs. We talked for a few minutes about the case, about how frightened she'd been, about her relief that the people who'd targeted her were going to prison for a long time. She mentioned Vincent once, saying her brother-in-law had been very kind to her after Robert's death, more protective than she'd expected, given how little they'd seen each other over the years. The comment was casual, without any indication she understood Vincent's real role in unraveling the fraud, or what his protection might mean beyond familial concern. I never spoke directly with Vincent Caruso about the case, but I saw him once from a distance, about a year after the trial concluded. I was having lunch at a restaurant downtown when he entered with two other men, all of them dressed in expensive suits, moving with the kind of confidence that suggested they were accustomed to deference and attention. Our eyes met briefly across the restaurant, and he gave me a slight nod of acknowledgement before being seated at a table in the back. I don't know if he recognized me from my testimony at the trial, or if he'd made it his business to know who I was, but that small gesture felt weighted with meaning. I couldn't fully interpret gratitude, perhaps, or recognition between people who'd both tried to help Claire from our different positions and with our different resources. I finished my meal quickly and left, uncomfortable being in the same space as someone whose reputation for violence and criminality was well established, even though I also recognized that Vincent's intervention had been crucial for protecting his sister-in-law and exposing the fraud ring. The moral complexity of the situation had never resolved for me into clear categories of right and wrong, good and evil. Vincent was a criminal responsible for terrible things, and he was also someone who'd protected his brother's widow when the legal system had been too slow to prevent her victimization. Both truths existed simultaneously without canceling each other out. The county implemented new procedures after the fraud ring was exposed, measures designed to prevent similar schemes from succeeding in the future. All property transfers involving elderly homeowners now triggered additional verification steps, with direct contact required to confirm the transfer was legitimate and understood by the property owner. Notary services used in property transactions were subject to more rigorous verification, with database checks to ensure legitimacy. Training was provided for county staff to recognize red flags that might indicate fraud, using the documents I'd flagged as teaching examples of what to look for. These reforms were necessary and valuable, but I also recognized their limitations. Determined criminals would adapt their methods, finding new vulnerabilities to exploit, targeting victims through approaches we hadn't anticipated. The fraud ring we'd caught represented one iteration of an ongoing problem: elder financial exploitation that took many forms and would continue as long as elderly people controlled assets that criminals wanted and systems existed that could be manipulated through paperwork and deception. Protecting vulnerable populations required constant vigilance and adaptation, recognizing that procedural safeguards were important but insufficient without underlying cultural changes that valued and protected elderly community members, that didn't leave widows like Claire isolated and vulnerable to predators, who saw their grief as opportunity. Claire lived another 7 years after the trial, remaining in the home she and Robert had shared, the home that had nearly been stolen from her through an elaborate scam she'd never fully understood until afterward. I checked on her occasionally, stopping by under the pretext of following up on county records, but really just wanting to make sure she was all right, that no other scammers had targeted her, that she felt safe and secure. She always welcomed these visits, offering coffee and conversation, talking about her children and grandchildren, about Robert and the life they'd built together, about her gratitude for people who'd helped protect her when she'd been most vulnerable. She never spoke about Vincent beyond occasional mentions of how kind her brother-in-law had been, how he'd visited more often after Robert's death, how he'd made sure she had help with things Robert had always handled. I wondered sometimes if she understood who Vincent really was, if anyone had explained his criminal background and the complicated way he'd helped expose the fraud targeting her. But maybe it didn't matter what she understood. Maybe what was important was that she'd felt protected and valued, that people had fought for her when she couldn't fight for herself, that her home and security had been preserved, even though the methods of that preservation were morally complicated. When Claire died peacefully in her sleep at age 78, her funeral was attended by family, friends, and neighbors who'd known her for decades. Vincent Caruso was there, sitting quietly in the back of the church, his presence noted but not remarked upon except in whispers. People who knew or suspected who he was maintaining respectful distance. I attended the funeral because I developed genuine affection for Claire through our occasional visits, because her case had affected me deeply and made me more conscious of how I approached my work and my responsibility to protect vulnerable people through careful attention to the documents that crossed my desk. After the service, as people gathered at Claire's house for the reception, I found myself standing near Vincent on the front lawn, both of us looking at the modest home that had been the center of so much conflict and concern. Vincent spoke without looking at me, his voice quiet enough that only I could hear, saying that Robert would have been grateful someone had protected Claire, that his brother had left their family business to build something clean and good, that he'd deserved to know his wife would be safe after he was gone. It was the only conversation we ever had, brief and elliptical, but it confirmed what I'd suspected, that Vincent's intervention in Claire's case had been about honoring his brother's memory, about protecting the life Robert had chosen, even though that choice had meant rejecting everything Vincent represented. Years have passed since Claire's funeral, and I still work at the county clerk's office, still process property transfers and title changes with the same careful attention that led me to identify the fraud targeting Claire. The fraud ring members are still in prison, serving the long sentences the judge imposed, their scheme dismantled, and their victims offered some measure of justice, even if many never recovered the homes they'd lost. Vincent Caruso died 3 years ago, officially of a heart attack, though there were rumors about power struggles within his organization that might have accelerated his death. His funeral was major news, hundreds of people attending, federal agents photographing attendees to map organized crime relationships, reporters covering the death of a man who'd been both feared and respected, whose life had contained profound contradictions that defied simple categorization. I didn't attend his funeral, but I thought about him when I heard the news, remembering that brief conversation on Claire's lawn, the complicated legacy of someone who'd built his power through crime, but who'd also protected his brother's widow with a loyalty that transcended their different life choices. The story of Claire and the fraud ring and Vincent's intervention remains part of my personal history, a case that taught me about vigilance and vulnerability, about how criminals exploit bureaucratic systems, about the complicated ways protection sometimes comes from unexpected sources, about the moral ambiguities that characterize real situations rather than the clear narratives we prefer in stories about good triumphing over evil. I tell this story sometimes to new employees at the county clerk's office, using it as a teaching example about why careful attention to documents matters, why procedural vigilance isn't just bureaucratic obsessiveness, but essential protection for vulnerable populations who depend on government systems working correctly. I describe the forged signatures, the shell companies, the fake credentials, the systematic targeting of elderly widows and widowers, all the elements of the fraud that we're now trained to recognize and flag. But I don't tell the full story. Don't mention Vincent Caruso's involvement, or the complicated way organized crime intersected with justice. In Claire's case, that part of the narrative is too complex for training purposes, raises questions about prosecutorial ethics and information sources that are better left unexamined by people who just need to know what red flags to look for in property documents. The sanitized version is sufficient for its purpose, teaching vigilance without exploring the moral complications of how that particular case was resolved. But I carry the full story anyway, understanding that reality is messier than training materials acknowledge, that protection sometimes comes from sources we'd prefer not to rely on, that justice and crime can intersect in ways that challenge our assumptions about clear moral categories. Claire's case was resolved successfully. By most measures, she kept her home. The criminals were caught and imprisoned, other victims were identified, and some received restitution. New procedures were implemented to prevent similar frauds. But the success depended partly on an organized crime boss who'd gathered intelligence through illegal means, who'd provided information that law enforcement couldn't obtain legally, who'd intervened because his brother's widow deserved protection, even though his brother had spent his life rejecting everything Vincent represented. That complexity doesn't negate the value of the outcome, but it does complicate any simple narrative about how justice was achieved and what it cost to achieve it. About 2 years after Vincent's death, I received an unexpected package at my office. It had been delivered by courier, not through regular mail, with my name typed on a plain manila envelope containing no return address or identifying information. Inside was a letter written on expensive stationery, the handwriting elegant and old-fashioned, clearly from someone of an older generation who'd learned penmanship when it was still taught as an essential skill. The letter was from Claire's oldest daughter, Margaret, who I'd met briefly at Claire's funeral, but hadn't spoken with since. She explained that she'd been going through her mother's papers, following the settling of the estate, organizing documents and photographs, trying to create a family archive that would preserve her parents' history for future generations. Among her mother's belongings, Margaret had found a journal that Claire had kept during the final years of her life, pages filled with reflections on her marriage, her grief after Robert's death, her fear during the property fraud incident, her gratitude for the various people who'd helped her through that crisis. Margaret said she'd been shocked to read her mother's account of events, to learn details about the fraud attempt and its resolution that Claire had never discussed with her children, to understand how close their mother had come to losing everything because of criminals who'd targeted her vulnerability. The letter continued with information that surprised me even more than its unexpected arrival. Margaret explained that her mother's journal contained extensive passages about Vincent Caruso, reflections that suggested Claire had understood far more about her brother-in-law than she'd ever indicated in our conversations. Claire had written about Vincent's visits after Robert's death, how he'd checked on her regularly, how he'd made sure she had help with household repairs and financial matters she'd always relied on Robert to handle. She'd written about recognizing Vincent's protectiveness, understanding that it came from loyalty to Robert and from codes of family obligation that transcended the vast differences in how the two brothers had lived their lives. More significantly, Claire had apparently known about Vincent's role in exposing the fraud ring, had been told directly by Vincent that he'd made sure the people who targeted her would be caught and punished, had understood that her protection came from her dead husband's connection to organized crime, even though Robert had spent decades distancing himself from that world. Claire's journal entries showed someone who'd been fully aware of the moral complexity of her situation, who'd felt both gratitude and discomfort about being protected by a criminal, who'd recognized that her safety had come at costs she couldn't fully measure, but that involved violence and intimidation she preferred not to think about too directly. Margaret's letter explained that reading these journal entries had forced her to re-evaluate everything she'd understood about her father's family history and her Uncle Vincent's relationship with their mother. She'd known her father had come from a complicated background, that he'd left some kind of family business to pursue legitimate work and build a different kind of life. But the full truth about Vincent's criminal empire and his ongoing connection to their family had been carefully hidden by Robert, who'd wanted his children to grow up without any association with organized crime or knowledge of their uncle's activities. Learning this history as an adult, reading her mother's nuanced reflections on accepting protection from sources she morally opposed but pragmatically needed, had complicated Margaret's understanding of family loyalty and moral compromise. She'd written to thank me for my role in protecting her mother, to share Claire's private gratitude that she'd never fully expressed publicly, and to ask if I'd be willing to meet with her to discuss what I knew about the case and Vincent's involvement. Margaret was trying to understand her family's history completely, she explained. Not to judge her parents or her uncle, but to comprehend the full complexity of choices they'd made and circumstances they'd navigated. I agreed to meet Margaret at a coffee shop near the courthouse, curious about what she wanted to know, and uncertain how much I should share about Vincent's involvement in a case that had been officially resolved without acknowledging his contribution. When we met, Margaret was in her late 40s, carrying herself with a professional confidence that suggested success in whatever career she'd built. She thanked me again for meeting her, for being willing to discuss events that must have seemed distant and resolved from my perspective. We talked for nearly 2 hours, Margaret asking detailed questions about how I'd discovered the fraud, what the investigation had involved, how law enforcement had identified and arrested the criminals responsible. I answered honestly but carefully, describing the official version of events while watching Margaret's face to gauge whether she wanted or needed to hear about the complications that version omitted. Finally, she asked directly about Vincent's role, explaining that her mother's journal had been clear that he'd been instrumental in exposing the fraud ring, but hadn't specified what exactly he'd done or how he'd obtained information that law enforcement couldn't access through legal channels. I made a decision in that moment to tell Margaret the full truth, as I understood it, recognizing that she deserved to know the complete story of how her mother had been protected, even if that story was morally complicated and ethically ambiguous. I explained how Vincent had appeared at the district attorney's office, how he'd provided intelligence about the fraud ring's operations and participants, how prosecutors had struggled with whether to use information from a criminal source, how they'd ultimately decided to verify his intelligence independently before building cases based on what he'd revealed. I described the ethical debates, the concerns about tainted evidence, and inappropriate cooperation with organized crime, the way official narratives had been constructed to omit Vincent's involvement while still allowing prosecution to proceed. Margaret listened without interrupting, her expression showing the careful attention of someone processing information that challenged existing understanding and required integration into a more complex worldview. When I finished, she sat quietly for a long moment before speaking. She said it made sense, that her mother's journal entries now had context they'd lacked before, that she understood better why Claire had written with such conflicted emotions about Vincent's protection. Margaret shared more from Claire's journal entries, reading passages that revealed her mother's sophisticated understanding of the situation she'd found herself in. Claire had written about feeling grateful to Vincent, while also feeling troubled by what his protection implied, by the methods he'd used to gather information, and the violence that was probably involved in convincing criminals to reveal details about their operations. She'd written about discussing this complexity with a priest, about struggling to reconcile her Catholic values with acceptance of help from someone whose life was built on activities the church condemned. The priest had apparently told Claire that accepting protection didn't make her complicit in Vincent's crimes, that being saved by someone didn't require approving of everything they'd done, that gratitude could coexist with moral disagreement. This pastoral guidance had given Claire permission to accept Vincent's protection without resolving all the ethical complications it created. to hold contradictory truths simultaneously, without forcing them into false coherence. Margaret said reading these entries had been revelatory, showing her mother as someone who'd thought deeply about difficult questions, rather than someone who'd been naive or oblivious to the moral complexity of her circumstances. It had increased Margaret's respect for Claire, seeing how she'd navigated impossible situations with more wisdom and nuance than her children had given her credit for. We talked about Robert too, about the choice he'd made at 25 to leave his brother's world and build something completely different. Margaret knew some of this story, but not all the details. Her father had told his children that he'd worked for the family business when he was young, but had decided he wanted different things, had left with Vincent's blessing, and had maintained only minimal contact afterward. What Margaret hadn't known was how complete the separation had been, how determined Robert was to protect his family from any association with organized crime, how carefully he'd constructed a life that had nothing to do with violence or illegal enterprise. Claire's journal revealed that Robert had lived with constant anxiety about his past catching up with him, about Vincent's activities, bringing federal attention that might somehow extend to investigating Robert's early years before he'd gone legitimate. He'd worried about his children being stigmatized if anyone learned about their uncle's criminal empire, about Claire being endangered by any connection to Vincent's world. These fears had shaped how Robert structured his life, the boundaries he'd maintained, the careful distance he'd kept from his brother, despite maintaining underlying affection and loyalty. Vincent had apparently understood and respected Robert's choices, had never asked him to return or participate in family business, had protected Robert's separation by ensuring that no one in the organization ever contacted him or created situations that might compromise his legitimate life. The relationship between the two brothers, as Margaret came to understand it through her mother's journal and our conversation, was a study in loyalty that transcended moral judgment. Vincent and Robert had fundamentally different values and chose opposite paths, but their bond remained strong enough that Vincent felt obligated to protect Robert's widow years after his brother's death. Robert had rejected everything Vincent represented, but he'd never rejected Vincent himself, maintaining a connection that acknowledged shared history and family ties without endorsing or participating in Vincent's criminal activities. This kind of relationship seemed impossible to people who thought in absolute categories of right and wrong, who believed that maintaining any connection with criminals was itself a form of complicity. But families were more complicated than moral absolutism allowed, Margaret observed. People loved each other despite profound disagreements about how to live, maintained loyalties that didn't require approval, protected each other, even when protection meant accepting help from sources they'd otherwise oppose. Robert and Vincent's relationship embodied these complexities, showing how people could be simultaneously estranged and connected, morally opposed and personally loyal, living completely different lives while maintaining bonds that endured across decades and differences. Margaret asked whether I thought her mother had been right to accept Vincent's protection, whether the outcome justified the methods, whether Claire should have refused help from a criminal source, even if that meant losing her home to fraud. These were exactly the questions I'd struggled with since first learning about Vincent's involvement, questions without clear answers that depended on what values you prioritized and what costs you were willing to accept in pursuit of those values. I told Margaret honestly that I didn't know, that I'd thought about it extensively without reaching definitive conclusions. Claire had been genuinely vulnerable, I explained, targeted by sophisticated criminals who'd almost succeeded in stealing everything she owned. The legal system had been too slow to protect her proactively, only catching the fraud after I'd happened to notice irregularities that many clerks might have missed. Vincent's intervention had been effective in ways legal investigation couldn't have been, providing intelligence that led to arrests and prevented future victims. But that effectiveness came through methods that violated the rule of law, that involved intimidation and violence, that reinforced organized crime's power even while using that power for what appeared to be a just purpose? Could you accept the good outcome while condemning the methods that produced it? Could you be grateful to someone whose overall life was destructive even when specific actions were protective? These weren't academic questions for Claire or Margaret, but deeply personal ones about family, loyalty, survival, and moral complexity. The conversation with Margaret changed how I thought about the case and my role in it. Before reading Claire's journal entries through Margaret's letter and hearing more complete context about the family dynamics, I'd thought of myself as having saved Claire through bureaucratic vigilance, through doing my job carefully enough to catch fraud that others might have missed. That was true as far as it went, but it was also incomplete. My discovery had triggered an investigation that brought Vincent's attention to his sister-in-law's situation, had created circumstances where his intervention became possible and necessary. I'd been one link in a chain of events that ultimately protected Claire. Through a combination of legal procedure and extra-legal power, official investigation, and criminal intelligence. None of the links alone would have been sufficient without my initial discovery. The fraud might have succeeded before anyone noticed. Without Vincent's intelligence, law enforcement might not have been able to identify all the perpetrators and prevent future frauds. Without prosecutors' careful work to verify Vincent's information independently, the cases might have been thrown out as fruit of the poisonous tree. The successful resolution required all these elements working together, even when the combination was ethically complicated and morally ambiguous. Margaret and I stayed in contact after that initial conversation, meeting occasionally to discuss her ongoing research into her family's history and the complicated legacy her parents had left. She was writing a book, she eventually revealed, a family memoir that would explore the relationship between her father and Vincent, the choices Robert had made to leave organized crime, the way Claire had navigated widowhood, with protection from a brother-in-law whose life contradicted everything she believed in. The book wasn't meant to glorify organized crime or suggest that mob bosses were misunderstood heroes, Margaret emphasized. Rather, it would explore the genuine complexity of real people making difficult choices in circumstances that didn't offer clear right answers, that required accepting help from imperfect sources because perfect help wasn't available, that demonstrated how family loyalty and moral principle could conflict in ways that forced compromises no one would choose if better options existed. She wanted to interview me for the book, to include my perspective on the fraud case and how it intersected with Vincent's protection of Claire. I initially hesitated, uncertain whether I wanted my role documented in a published account that would include details about Vincent's involvement that had been carefully omitted from official records. But Margaret convinced me that the story had value beyond our particular case, that it illustrated broader truths about elder fraud, prosecutorial ethics, the relationship between organized crime and communities, and the complicated ways justice sometimes requires accepting help from sources we'd prefer to remain independent from. The book Margaret eventually published was titled My Father's Brother, and it received significant attention for its nuanced exploration of family loyalty across moral divides. Critics praised her refusal to simplify complex relationships into easy narratives about good and evil, her willingness to present her father and uncle as fully human rather than as hero and villain. The chapter about Claire's fraud case and Vincent's intervention was particularly discussed, with reviewers noting how effectively Margaret presented the ethical dilemmas without pretending to resolve them definitively. My role in the story was accurately but minimally portrayed. I was the county clerk who'd caught the fraud, who'd triggered the investigation, who'd testified at trial. But I wasn't presented as any kind of hero or singular savior. Margaret correctly understood that everyone involved had contributed to the resolution in different ways, that the outcome had required multiple actors with different capabilities and different moral frameworks, all working toward a shared goal, even when their methods and motivations varied significantly. The book generated debate about whether prosecutors should ever accept information from criminal sources, about what protections elderly victims deserve, about how families maintain relationships across fundamental moral disagreements. Some readers criticized Margaret for presenting Vincent too sympathetically, for not sufficiently condemning organized crime's destructive impact on communities. Others felt she'd been too harsh on her uncle, that she hadn't fully appreciated the protection he'd provided, or the codes of honor that motivated his actions. The range of responses demonstrated that Margaret had succeeded in presenting genuine complexity that resisted simple interpretation. The publication of Margaret's book created unexpected consequences that neither of us had fully anticipated. Federal prosecutors, who'd been investigating remaining members of Vincent's organization, used the book as a roadmap for understanding relationships and operations they'd previously struggled to penetrate. Defense attorneys for accused mob members tried to subpoena Margaret and me, arguing that the book revealed information about Vincent's involvement in the fraud investigation that undermined the prosecution's official narrative and might constitute exculpatory evidence for their clients. Journalists started investigating whether other criminal cases had involved unreported cooperation with organized crime, whether Vincent's intelligence had been used in prosecutions beyond the fraud ring case, whether the district attorney's office had a pattern of accepting tainted information while obscuring its sources in official records. The controversy generated by these investigations was significant enough that several prosecutors faced disciplinary proceedings, forced to defend decisions they'd made years earlier, to accept Vincent's help while maintaining public fictions about how intelligence had been obtained. Margaret felt terrible about these unintended consequences, worried that her attempt to tell her family's story honestly had harmed people who'd been trying to protect vulnerable victims and bring criminals to justice. I told her that the truth had value even when revealing it created complications, that prosecutorial deception about evidence sources was itself problematic regardless of whether the deception served apparently just purposes, that systems that relied on hidden cooperation with criminals needed to be examined and reformed even when examination was uncomfortable. The professional fallout from Margaret's book included my own testimony before a grand jury investigating whether the district attorney's office had improperly used information from criminal sources in multiple prosecutions. I explained under oath exactly what had happened in Claire's case, how Vincent had provided intelligence, how prosecutors had verified that intelligence independently, how they'd constructed official narratives that omitted mention of Vincent's involvement. The assistant district attorney leading the inquiry asked whether I thought justice had been served in Claire's case, given the complicated way evidence had been obtained. I responded that Claire had been protected, that criminals who'd targeted her and dozens of other elderly victims had been imprisoned, that new procedures had been implemented to prevent similar frauds, that by most practical measures, the outcome had been just, even if the process had been ethically complicated. But I also acknowledged that using intelligence from mob sources created precedents and relationships that were dangerous, regardless of how carefully prosecutors tried to maintain independence and verify information through legal channels. The grand jury ultimately declined to bring charges against any prosecutors, finding that while their decisions had been ethically questionable, they hadn't risen to the level of criminal conduct. The decision satisfied no one. Critics felt prosecutors had been let off too easily for violating principles about evidence sources, while prosecutors felt they'd been unfairly targeted for making difficult decisions in service of protecting vulnerable victims. Years have passed since these investigations and controversies, and I'm nearing retirement from the county clerk's office after nearly 30 years of processing property documents and catching occasional frauds before they could victimize homeowners. The systems we implemented after Claire's case have prevented numerous attempted thefts, catching forged signatures and suspicious transactions before they could be completed. But new schemes emerge constantly, Criminals adapting their methods to circumvent protections we've implemented, finding new vulnerabilities in systems that will never be perfectly secure, as long as valuable assets can be stolen through paperwork manipulation. The work continues, will continue after I retire, requiring constant vigilance and adaptation from people who care enough to look carefully at documents rather than just processing them routinely. Margaret and I still meet occasionally, our friendship having developed from that initial conversation about her mother's journal into something genuine and lasting. We talk about her family, about her continued research into organized crime and community relationships, about the ongoing debates her book generated regarding prosecutorial ethics and evidence sources. She's become a sort of informal advocate for elder fraud victims, working with nonprofit organizations that provide resources and support, pushing for stronger protections and harsher penalties for criminals who target vulnerable elderly populations. I think about Claire often, especially when processing property documents involving elderly widows whose circumstances mirror hers alone, grieving, managing properties and finances they'd always relied on spouses to handle, vulnerable to scammers who see their isolation and confusion as opportunity. Each time I catch a suspicious document, each time I flag an inconsistency that might indicate fraud, I think about how close Claire came to losing everything because criminals correctly calculated she'd be an easy target. I think about Vincent, too, about the complicated legacy he left, about how organized crime and justice intersected in ways that challenged simple narratives about right and wrong. He was undeniably a criminal whose organization caused enormous harm through violence, drug trafficking, extortion, and corruption. But he was also someone who protected his brother's widow with a loyalty that transcended decades of separation and fundamental moral differences. Both truths matter. Both define who he was, and holding them simultaneously, without forcing false resolution, is the only honest way to understand his role in Claire's story. The case taught me that real situations are almost always more complex than the categories we try to fit them into, that justice sometimes requires accepting help from sources we'd prefer to remain independent from, that protecting vulnerable people can require compromises that leave everyone involved feeling uncomfortable about methods, even when they're grateful for outcomes. These lessons haven't made subsequent decisions easier, haven't provided clear guidelines for navigating future ethical dilemmas, but they've made me more thoughtful about complexity and more skeptical of anyone who claims simple answers to questions that involve competing values and imperfect choices. That seems like modest wisdom after 3 decades of work, but maybe modest wisdom is all any of us can hope to achieve when dealing with systems designed by humans with all our contradictions and limitations.